What have you always wanted to know about Boise State Public Radio? Join us for another round Wednesday, March 19th at Mad Swede Brew Hall in downtown Boise from 6 to 8 p.m. Learn more about our operations, news content, and our service mission. We welcome your questions and look forward to sharing more about what we do here at Boise State Public Radio. More details can be found on our website at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. When the podcast Scandalized launched last year, there was a deep hunger for finding out more about political scandals, especially those that have had a big impact on our country. When Boise State political scientists Charlie Hunt and Jackie Kettler start each episode, they relate not only all the delicious details of each scandal, but the meaning and the motivations behind them. And then they look at how the scandal has had an impact on our politics. Well, we wanted to check back in with Charlie and Jackie to find out how their first season went and how people are responding to the podcast. They will also be taping one of their episodes live at Treefort next week, and you can watch and ask questions. We talked back in September, just as Scandalized was launching. Jackie, what has the response been so far to the podcast?
Oh, it's been so great. And of course, collaborating with everyone at Boise State Public Radio has really helped to get the word out there and being part of the NPR network. But we've received positive feedback and interactions from across the country, as well as it's helped foster some really fun conversations and connections here in Idaho. So it's just been so great to have it out in the world.
Yeah, Gemma.
And Charlie, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add, I think you're exactly right that there's a hunger for this sort of thing. I feel like people see scandals out there all the time. That's what they think of when they think of politics. And I'm really happy we've been able to reach an audience in a way that we can sort of add context to those scandals, talk about why they actually matter beyond, as you said, just sort of digging into the juicy details, which we do love plenty of that as well.
You know, Charlie, I think whenever someone starts a podcast or a program, you want folks to listen, right? You guys have gained thousands of fans. Did you think that this would be as popular as it has become?
I'll be honest, I didn't know what to expect. Like Jackie said, we were so happy to be able to partner with Boise State Public Radio because, you know, you guys have such an engaged audience who cares about this stuff. I think we were both sort of wondering, you know, whether other people were as interested in political scandals as we were. And it turns out people were. Yeah, we've been so delighted about the response to the show. You know, people pitch us their own ideas for scandals they'd like us to cover, right? Or maybe scandals they'd like us to avoid. And certainly there are plenty out there. So we always welcome suggestions from listeners in the future.
So, Jackie, for folks who may not have listened to Scandalized yet, give us a quick glimpse of what political scandals you've covered in the first season.
We covered a wide range, including a governor that tried to sell a Senate seat and a governor that went missing. We covered scandals about campaign finance fraud, as well as politicians enriching themselves through their office. We also touched on different lies that politicians tell. So we really covered a wide variety of scandals in the first season, from like national politics more to state politics. And that was for us really fun to dig into the different types of scandals that politicians get involved in.
Charlie, I want to go back to something that you said about people reaching out and saying, "Oh, cover this scandal," or the other part of "Don't cover that scandal." With that said, are you going to cover any of the scandals that maybe someone doesn't want you to cover?
Possibly. I mean, there were a couple of things that I think we tried to do in this first season, which was cover a variety, not just of different types of politicians in both parties, politicians at the national level that maybe people have heard of. And then we covered a couple that we thought maybe people hadn't heard of. You know, we didn't want to just do sort of the typical ones, you know, Nixon and Watergate, or maybe some of Donald Trump's recent scandals. We wanted to sort of cover a variety that would help us really dig into some of the details that people maybe didn't hear before, or in ways that touch on the expertise that Jackie and I have as political scientists and trying to bring that edge to it. On the other hand, we know there have been, just in the past few months since the first season aired, a whole variety of scandals that, Jackie and I text each other every day about this stuff of like, oh my gosh, we have to cover this in season 2, and we've already run out of potential slots. So I think we'll have to get to some of that stuff sooner rather than later.
So I want to dive into a couple of the scandals, and I want to start with what you have called the Elizabeth Warren's tricky history with her heritage. We have a clip from that episode, so let's take a listen.
On a number of job application forms over the decades, Warren had checked Native American as a racial or ethnic group. Warren, citing what at the time seemed to be only anecdotal evidence from family lore, claimed to be part Cherokee and Delaware Indian, and had listed herself as a minority in the Directory of Law Professors from 1986 until 1995. In 1996, for example, the Harvard Crimson, which is the school's student newspaper, covered a study that had been done about faculty at Harvard Law School, where Warren was a professor at the time. The article says that, quote, although the conventional wisdom among students and faculty is that the law school faculty includes no minority women, the spokesperson for the law school said Professor of Law Elizabeth Warren is Native American, end quote. It was also reported that Warren contributed recipes to a Native American cookbook that was published in 1984 in Muskogee, Oklahoma. She signed her entries, Elizabeth Warren, Cherokee.
Okay, let's dig into this timeline a bit on this one. Jackie or Charlie, tell us more about what happened in this scandal.
Sure. So, this is an example of one that maybe listeners might remember. This kind of unfolded in 2017, 2018, 2019 as Elizabeth Warren was actually sort of preparing to run for president in 2020. Mm-hmm. And she was sort of presenting herself in that context as, an antagonist of then, in his first term, President Trump, as someone who might be able to challenge him in the next election. And, as happens in those cases, things come out, right? Reporters start digging. And in this case, there were these couple of instances in the 80s and 90s where Warren had referred to this heritage. It turns out that the sort of lineage is pretty thin. It's, a more distant ancestor. And she ended up getting this DNA test done basically to silence her critics, to prove that she did, in fact, have, Native American lineage. The problem was it came off as really kind of callous, kind of tone deaf, and ended up kind of doing more harm than good in her case. And so, it ended up being this big sort of jumbled understanding of what her lineage was. And of course, listeners might know that Donald Trump then, to this day, he continues to deride her and refer to her derogatorily as Pocahontas out at these campaign stops. And that's sort of how this has gone ever since.
Jackie, what was it about Warren's scandal that caught your eye and made you want to cover this?
Well, I think one thing that we touch on across a few of these scandals is how this might have happened and how some of this might just be very kind of human behavior or natural, like just happens. Mm-hmm. This is probably a family's story, right? That had been handed down. It was a family belief that there was a strong heritage here. And so I think a lot of families, a lot of people might be like, well, I thought I was this, I had this heritage, but it turns out I actually don't. Also, we thought it was very interesting how her opponents, in this case Trump, really used it to attack her and that really grabbed onto this. And this is something that we are interested in and how scandals play out. And sometimes, it's used as kind of a weapon by the opponent to really attack the person.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, you mentioned that Elizabeth Warren ended up taking a DNA test. And you talk in this episode about how it wasn't just the scandal itself, but it was how she responded to it. Why, in your opinion, is that important? And not just for her, but really for any politician that's caught in a scandal?
It's a great question. I think not just in this scandal, but in others that we covered in this first season, we came across a number of folks who, if they had handled the aftermath of the scandal differently, I think their stories might have gone differently. And that can go both ways. One recurring segment we had in a couple of episodes was this segment we called Sorry, Not Sorry, where we look at basically whether or not and how the politician decided to own up. And this is a case in Warren's case where, she made this initial mistake. The DNA tests, I think looking back, we can say was not a good idea. And she faced a lot of flack for that from the press, from the late night hosts and things like that. And then eventually she met with Native American groups, met with that community who generally is pretty supportive of Democrats, and, offered a heartfelt apology, acknowledged that the DNA test was a big mistake, and was eventually able to move past that. Obviously, she didn't get the nomination for president in 2020, but she ran a pretty strong campaign, and this didn't end up being a huge sort of albatross around her neck as she was running, because she was able to sort of put it to bed. And that was certainly not the case with some of the other politicians we talked about.
And Jackie, back to your point about, right, maybe being human or this being like a family story. I mean, I remember a few times my dad saying something about, well, we've got some Native American heritage. I have no idea if that's true or not. But I think the difference is I would never, ever say, well, that's part of my heritage, because A, it's not. B, I don't know if it's true. Right. And so part of that is as politicians, though, they're putting themselves out there. And when you say something, it has the potential to stick and either benefit you or not.
I think that's exactly right. And one thing we talk some about in the episodes about lying is why do politicians lie? It may be to kind of inflate your credentials, but it may also be to try to gain some sort of perceived advantage or to stand out. And I mean, and again, like some of this may be somewhat human nature, but I think you're right, Gemma. There's also a line that most of us would not cross. And so it's interesting in this case, like, well, why did she continue, at least for a while, to emphasize this heritage, and where it did become much more problematic than being like, well, my family says that there's this heritage. And so there is that line. And what is that line? And that's something that we tried to dig into across several different types of stories of where is it just some embellishment or kind of, well, I think this is going on, and where is it now a problem?
So with that said, Jackie, is there a playbook for politicians if they're caught in a scandal, or is it that every situation is unique?
Well, we found a wide variety of reactions from the politicians that we covered in this first season. And Charlie mentioned earlier, right? Some response is to defend, to try to explain away, or to claim that it's a witch hunt, right? That they are being attacked. And then we have some politicians that actually do take the route of saying, I was wrong, I messed up, and I hope we can move past this.
So I want to dive into another scandal from your first season of the podcast. Now, this one centers on Republican congressional candidate J.R. Majewski, who reportedly lied about his record of military service. So let's listen to this clip.
But in September of 2022, the Associated Press published a months-long investigation in which they obtained official Air Force records for Majewski's period of service from 1999 to 2002. It turns out that instead of Afghanistan, Majewski served primarily on an Air Force base in Japan for much of his active duty service. In May of 2002, records show that he did deploy to the Middle East, not to Afghanistan, but to Qatar, where he helped load and unload planes while serving as a passenger operations specialist. Majewski also appears to have lied about why he left the service. He received what's called a non-judicial punishment, not for a dormitory brawl as his campaign initially said, but for driving drunk while living on the Air Force base in Japan he was deployed to. One result of this punishment was that he was forbidden from re-enlisting in the service after his initial 4-year stint.
Okay, Charlie, let's dive more into this scandal. Tell us more about this, and I guess why he lied about this?
Well, why he lied about it, it's a bit of a mystery, in part because
Hmm.
he took a very different route than we just talked about with Elizabeth Warren, where to this day he maintains that this is a media smear job, that he did in fact serve in Afghanistan, and that everyone besides him is lying, even though the evidence says otherwise. I think it's important to note here that in Majewski's case, obviously this is lower profile. It's not a presidential race, it's a U.S. House race. But this was a Republican who was running in a very competitive district. This was a very winnable race. This was a winnable seat that that Republicans would have been able to take away from Democrats. And one thing we explored in this episode is how the Republicans were able to nominate such a flawed candidate, because he was a candidate who had a number of interesting quirks, let's say, that made him an interesting nominee for that district. But, this was another instance where, the media really started looking into his campaign, started looking into his records, and he had made sort of such a deal out of his military service and highlighted his service in Afghanistan, or supposed service in Afghanistan, that it ended up being what we tend to call this idea of stolen valor, right? Of politicians, or really anyone, claiming military service or claiming to have gotten injured or things like that when they did not in fact do those things or serve in combat. And we cover a couple of different instances of this in that episode.
So, what's interesting to me about this in particular, Charlie, is that it seems that so many politicians, I don't want to say lie about their military service, because a lot of them have served in the military. It seems that maybe sometimes they maybe conflate a little bit about maybe where they were stationed, or if they served in a war zone. I mean, we saw this even in the most recent presidential race, right, with a back and forth with J.D. Vance, and even and what he said about Tim Walz. So, what do you think it is about military service in particular where these politicians seem to kind of almost fall into this trap?
Well, it's a great question. We covered this scandal in conjunction with a bunch of other scandals of politicians either lying or stretching the truth about their qualifications for office. And, military service is something, it's if you've got it and you're a congressional candidate or a presidential candidate, you are highlighting it, right? It's something that Americans rightly see as a service rendered to your country, something that, is impressive in a lot of ways, where you're engaging in sort of the highest kind of public service, and citing that in a campaign as a way of saying, look, I gave my life, my body for my country in the military, and therefore I'm going to serve you in Congress or the presidency or whatever else. And so it could be, right, that politicians, memory lapses can happen. People get confused. We don't know what's in these people's heads, right? But we do know that it is seen as a desirable characteristic. There's political science that talks about it and has found that it's a desirable characteristic for voters, that voters like this. And so if it's like you're applying for a job application in this case, and maybe you inflate your resume a little bit, but to do it in this way with military service is really kind of unseemly, so that when it's found out, it ends up being a lot worse for you than if you had just told the truth.
And we should note that, I mean, the last president to serve in the military was George W. Bush, right? He was in the National Guard. But the last president to actually see combat was his father, George H.W. Bush. So it's not like we've been putting presidents in office in recent times who have had any military service, Charlie.
No, that's exactly right. It's interesting. One of the other scandals that came up in that episode was, in a way, kind of a non-scandal. It was about John Kerry, who was George W. Bush's opponent in 2004, and he, of course, did have extensive military service. Won a number of different medals, a Purple Heart in Vietnam, had this very heroic story. and was sort of smeared and attacked for that story by some other folks he had served with, basically accusing him of lying, but there's not really any evidence that he did lie. And so it also sort of shows how this can get weaponized, right? In the same way that we talked about with Elizabeth Warren, that people might, some people lie about their service, and then some people lie about others lying about their service, and it ends up with this sort of snake eating its tail kind of thing of lying.
So, Jackie, this was part of an episode that was titled The Truth About Lying in Politics, where you looked at what kind of lies politicians get in the most. So my question for you is, what kind of lies do politicians get into the most?
Well, I think a lot of times it really is about inflating credentials. And here, an example, thinking about military service, but also we talked about some of these other scandals where people claim like business success that maybe isn't quite accurate, or lying on the resume about whether it's like an educational credentials, right? Or other types of things like this that really try to make them look like a much more attractive candidate than they might be. What's interesting is for some of these candidates, they still have really impressive resumes in other ways, right? So that sometimes the questions are, why would they lie about this? And then it starts to raise questions, right? I think for voters, well, if they're lying about this, can we trust them in office? Like, is this something that we can move past? And so we tried to kind of evaluate reactions to lies. And I think going back to in the first segment where we talked about how politicians respond once they're caught in a lie matters for that.
So, Jackie, have how people reacted to politicians maybe conflating their resume changed at all over the decades? Like, I guess, are we more forgiving or are we less forgiving now?
Well, one thing we consider is the role of growing polarization and how much party matters, how individuals assess candidates. And for the most part, most voters vote their party kind of regardless. So one concern is that individual candidate qualifications or things like lying might matter a little bit less if people are prioritizing party above everything else. And it may be easier for people to dismiss concerns, especially if they're like, well, it's a witch hunt against my candidate. The other party's driving this. I'm still going to support them. So we're a little concerned that it's possible party plays such a role that some of these individual characteristics or actions may matter a little less.
Are there lies, Jacqueline, that the voting public will forgive or forget?
Well, I think that's a really great question. And I think, again, it kind of depends on a few different factors. I think for example, Senator Warren, I think for a lot of her supporters, we're pretty happy to forgive and move forward, right? I think there are other lies, especially once you start getting into like some of the stolen valor questions that are harder for some people to move forward. But regardless, I mean, Majewski still got a number of votes. So I think that it's really interesting to dig deeper into how voters assess some of these behaviors.
I have about a minute left, and I want to ask one more question, Jackie, and that is it that voters, forgive or forget, or frankly, do they just not pay attention?
Well, that's definitely one concern too, which is one of our
Right.
hopes in revisiting some of these scandals is to bring more attention to them.
Well, I have to say it has been such a pleasure to talk with the two of you again, and such great news about your podcast and how well it's doing. We have been thrilled to see it thrive and can't wait for season 2. So thank you both so much for taking time for us today.
Thanks so much, and we hope to see you all at Treefort next Thursday at 4:00 at the Boise Contemporary Theater.
Yeah, we've been speaking with Boise State political scientist Charlie Hunt and Jackie Kettler talking about their Scandalized podcast. As Charlie just mentioned, they will be recording an episode of the podcast live at Treefort next week, March 27th at 4 p.m. at Boise Contemporary Theater. And everyone is invited. Even if you don't have plans to go to Treefort, you can still participate in this live recording. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.